there. If you're listening to this, it means that you've officially made it to the new and improved version of Anna Rose Reads, the podcast. I'm Anna, as in Anna Rose Reads, and we're getting really professional. For those of you who have followed along with me now in my author interviews and YouTube videos for a while now, you know that it's been pretty bare bones operations, but I made a goal for myself in 2025 in that I wanted to get up to speed with the rest of the podcasting world. So here we are. We made it onto podcasting platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and now we're doing intros and outros. So first things first, I am incredibly excited to be sharing this conversation with you all today, with the one and only Chris Panatier, author of books such as The Redemption of Morgan Bright, The Phlebotomist, Stringers, and most recently Death on the Swayback, which came out from Rapture Publishing. It's a chapbook that is absolutely delightful. And I really have been wanting to talk to Chris about his artwork and his life as an artist, whether it's creating fiction or creating beautiful, stunning artwork. I just had so many burning questions for him about how he does it and his relationship with creativity and all of those different things that go into making something. And Chris is the absolute best guest. I mean, he is super kind, super friendly. We probably could have talked for a lot longer than the time that we did. And yeah, I mean, he's just an incredible guy, and I love his stuff. So if you haven't picked up a book of his yet, I cannot recommend it enough. But before we get to the main attraction, I do want to go ahead and lay out some housekeeping items. So like I said, if you're listening to this, this is an intro. That means that we are officially operating as a real podcast. And if you are still catching these interviews over on YouTube, you might notice that there's no longer video formatting. There's just a thumbnail that you can listen to this audio on. And I hate to say it, the video editing was just taking too much time. And quite frankly, everybody's internet is always in and out these days, so it's just easier to do, typical audio recording and get the thumbnail up on YouTube for everybody who's tagged along with me thus far, since that is where I started. And the audio formats are available on the podcast platforms I've mentioned, as well as my Substack. So with that out the way, without further ado, let's get to the good part. Let's get to the conversation, and I hope that you all enjoy it even a fraction as much as I did. Hello, Chris. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. It's a day after a Mardi Gras parade. I've had some fried chicken and I'm feeling much better.
I mean, you're upright.
hmm
That's like, you're awake, you're upright. You've got some caffeine there, I see. So
Oh yeah.
good. Good for you.
Checking all the boxes.
Yeah.
Oh man. But no, so we're here today. I've really been wanting to talk to you for probably about a year now since the
Oh,
release of your last book, The Redemption of Morgan Bright. But you are Chris Panatier. You are an author of kind of like speculative fiction, a little bit of sci-fi, horror. I'm gonna let you introduce yourself and talk a little bit more about your books. But I am a huge fan of yours and your artwork because you're an artist. So if people don't happen to know you like I know you, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
sure. You're so nice. I you did a fine job. I I do write fiction. I kind of started as a kind of a sci-fi writer, but I all my short fiction always pivoted real hard into horror. And then I started writing horror novels. My first full-throated horror novel was The Redemption of Morgan Bright, which came out in April of this year, 20 or last year, 2024. I can get the year right. And I didn't even go to Mardi Gras. So I'm already behind the eight ball here. And then my upcoming stuff is all horror. Um, and yeah, and I also have been doing sort of art on a professional level for about 15 years or so. So yeah, I do both of those things.
Yeah. It's a very like creative spectrum that I feel like you cover between your artwork, the writing, just like kind of like your presence in the community. It feels like it covers a lot of bases, which is really, really cool. I do kind of want to talk to you a little bit about your start in sci-fi and what that was like. Because and this is the thing is, I know genre is like kind of fluid. Like genre isn't, I'm one of those people who kind of believes that genre isn't real, but it also does
Mhm.
help readers find what they're looking to read. So it is real to a fault. But what was it like? Whenever you sit down to write something, do you think in terms of genre, or is it just the story that you want to tell and then you think about it later?
Well, I get, it's cliche to say it now, but like people say, oh, ideas are cheap. And when you're writing and you're always trying to think of new ideas, they kind of are.
Yeah.
And they just kind of start to come to you. I know that's been my experience, and of course, I've heard plenty of other authors say the same thing on podcasts and stuff. Um, and it's really about which ones kind of feel like they are sticking. Right now, or over the last year and a half and up until now, I do want to continue to pursue horror stuff. So even if I get an idea for a fantasy or sci-fi, if it can be done in short fiction, I might write it. In fact, I'm writing one right now that's probably going to be, I don't know, just like 3,000 words, and that one's pure sci-fi. It's horror adjacent because I think sci-fi is often very horror
Yeah.
adjacent. But I'm really focusing right now on kind of sticking with horror. I have pivoted. I have three books out, and I pivoted both times for the subsequent books. And on the one hand, that's really cool to build readership, but on the other hand, people don't know what to expect. That's great, I think, if you're like a super established author. If you're me and you're not, a little consistency might be nice for your readers. And I happen to love horror, but you and I have a lot in common because you and I have only recently kind of come to horror. I know I've heard you mention that on your podcast, and so that's sort of an interesting thing. I was always dark on the inside, but as far as consuming horror, I was either focused on something else or I was too scared, to be totally honest. And I still am a total scaredy cat. There's I have incidents around the house sitting on a shelf. I have not cracked it. Um, and I'm going to because I know I'm missing like something awesome. But it will likely be in a public place during the day. That's
Yeah.
what I do. So yeah, so I do tend to jump around a little bit, but right now I have 2.5 books currently written. Um, maybe 3.5 books currently written. They're all horror that are
Yeah.
not out yet. Yeah.
And well, first of all, I totally agree with your plan for instance around the house because I did make the mistake of reading it
Okay.
like late into the night one night, and you know how your house settles, and
Oh yeah.
it sounds that but even still, I was very immersed in that book, and the house creaked, and I very visibly
Yeah.
jumped reading that book. It's phenomenal. So I highly recommend reading it, but at your pace and at your
Yeah.
time for
Yeah.
sure. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that you're right. I think that, there's a lot of aspects of like, particularly sci-fi and fantasy that really tinge darker
Mhm.
whenever we let our imaginations run free. And I find a lot of sci-fi is like, well, what could happen in the future or even in the past that could go wrong and what's our response to it sometimes, especially from like
Yeah.
a scientific standpoint. And
Yeah.
to me, a lot of that reads as very horrific, a lot of, I'm thinking off the top of my head, like The Third Rule of Time Travel. I just read Philip Fracasse's upcoming
Uh-huh.
sci-fi
Oh, I'm very
novel.
excited about that book.
It's very good. And there are moments and it doesn't read, like classical horror because it's sci-fi, but there are moments in that book that just kind of like break your heart and make your stomach hurt in the same way that horror does because it's that dread and that knowing of like,
Yeah.
oh, this isn't meant to be or however you want to think about it. So, no, it's really interesting to see how like I said, that's part of the reason why I don't like to fully believe in genre. But like
Yeah.
you said, I think it does kind of set some expectations for whenever people go to pick up a book, what they're going to be getting into.
Oh,
Um,
certainly. Certainly.
Yeah. And so, it kind of brings me to my next point is I really want to talk to the me wanting to talk to you for the last year has been because of your book, The Redemption of Morgan Bright. I just kind of want to hear about the writing process. And I know that you've talked about it before, but it's been a full year. So I kind of, if I can get the perspective of like a year out, like
Yeah.
what that book has been like writing it, publishing it. And for people who don't know, it's a story about a it's a woman's struggle book. I mean, it's about mental health and the mistreatment of women and institutionalization and all these different things that, sometimes whenever you see that, and not to be crass, but sometimes when you see a man wrote this kind
Oh
of
yeah.
book, you're like, ugh. But Chris, I mean, it was phenomenal. I think that you did brilliant by it, all of it. And so I just want to hear about your experience writing it, publishing it, and now looking back at it a year out.
Thanks. That's a great question because I haven't been asked about kind of like looking back on it, but um yeah, The Redemption of Morgan Bright was written in direct response to the overturning of Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
Um and I I don't know, it's just something about my chemistry or whatever that I've always been extremely attuned to. Um Issues affecting people who are oppressed, and I'm like middle-aged white guy, straight white guy. And I just look around with my eyes wide open, and sometimes I just have to check out because I get so upset. There's no reason to treat small groups in an inhuman, awful way. And I was so angry when Roe was overturned that I already had the germ of an asylum, a supernatural asylum story kind of turning in my mind that was influenced by the true life story of Nellie Bly, who, for anyone who doesn't know, in 1893, at the age of 23, she had herself checked into a state asylum in New York. Um, the audacity, I mean, in that era to do that, in order to report on the condition of the people inside. And what happened, they tried to keep her there. And her editor had to like come and get her out. Even though in her book she wrote afterwards, she said, once I was in, she was like, I faked mental illness to get in, but once I was in, I acted totally normal. And they were like, oh no, you're positively deranged. And so I already had those germs of it, but it really took a hard turn into uh, a allegory on forced birth. And and so there's a lot of that in the book. And to your point about men writing women, the whole book is women. Though it's all women. There's like one or two male characters who are not the main characters. And Um, my greatest fear in writing this book was one, getting it wrong and doing something unintentionally, but without the proper attention, uh, and missing something that even though I was trying, I just missed because I'm not a woman. And so obviously I had a lot of people look at it. And uh, the feedback was pretty good. Most people were like, look, for most of these examples of men writing women badly are men not caring how they come across or even making an attempt to get it right. Generally, if you come from a genuine place, you're gonna you're gonna come close. And if you make a mistake and people can infer from the rest of the book that you were trying and you were not trying to do anything nefarious, or purposely misleading, then it'll be all right. And so, but still, my greatest fear was someone saying, "Why is this your story to tell?" And I had an answer ready. No one has asked me that. Um, no one has asked me that, which I'm very happy with because I think that it's everyone's story to tell. We don't we don't live in an all male society. Um, Women exist, and women are part of everyday life. And so, if you're an ally to women, I think it's everybody's story. And I've been really, really glad with the reception. And starting early on, I had some people read it, and they were like, do you pay attention to women? Like, what are you doing? I'm like, I do. I am a loudmouth and I do talk too much, but often I will just sit and actually listen and pay attention. So I did a lot of listening and paying attention for this book to try to get it as right as I could. Get those text messages right, how sisters would talk to each other, all of that.
Yeah, no, to me it came through. And I think the way that it won out for me, um, a lot of times whenever you're trying to tell a story that maybe isn't your own, or like, you walk in knowing there's a different perspective on this. Sometimes there's the case of like oversimplifying characters and making them
Yep.
either all good, all bad, or, and but your characters were just very human. Despite the batshit insanity that ensues
Yeah,
at
yeah,
towards the end of the book, everything about the sisterhood dynamic in those text messages and why they were angry at one another, or why they may have had a falling out, and the guilt, and everything that was experienced was very human. And their people are flawed, and that was how your characters were. And so to me, that's where it wins out, is whenever you're not being realistic towards how people really are, is where you kind of lose out, because you can still be a woman who's maybe not the Virgin Mary image of
hmm
whatever, but you're still entitled to fairness and
yes,
equality and humane treatment and all of these things. And so then that's when I think, whenever you get that sentiment under your belt, which you did, I mean, like, so at that point, it's like, hands off. And it's stuff that, like, I've kind of reflected on a lot, because I read Carrie for the first time last year. So then that was another one that you're like, I don't know how I'm gonna feel about this whenever I get to it. And then part of it, there I had some similar feelings about Grady Hendrix with Witchcraft for Wayward Girls, because that's a book that's heavily about,
yeah,
pregnancy and stuff. And it was another thing that I'm like, okay, well, let's see how it goes. But, much like you did with Morgan Bright, I think whenever you come to the table, one, being genuine,
yeah.
authentic, and not wholly good or bad, I think that's where you win out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I honestly, one of the best things I saw people saying, other than some people saying, "Oh my God," like when I was done, I turned to the front cover and I thought I had been reading a woman's book. Like Chris Panatier could be either way. And they're like, this is written by a man. And that was awesome to see. But even more than that, several people were like, I did not like Morgan Bright, the character. They're like, I did not like her. And I was like, good.
Yeah.
I didn't want her to be bad, but I didn't want her to be like this totally unrealistic portrait of women, especially a woman that something bad is going to happen to.
Yep.
I want to put people in conflict to go, do I still, even though I don't necessarily like this character's choices, I don't like who she's been, do I still value her rights as a human being when these other things happen to her? Because that says a lot about the reader.
Yeah.
Sometimes the reader's like, oh, well, I didn't care this happened to her because, I didn't like her as a character. That's kind of illuminating.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And also to the point of, whenever you have a character who's flawed like that, it adds dimension to her mission, like her whole
Yeah.
entire reasoning for like why the book even began. Because if
Yes.
she, like, and it's stuff I'm kind of trying to be careful because I don't want to spoil anything. But her and her sister were not on the best of terms whenever her
Yeah.
sister passed. And so her decision to go in and to commit to this cause, this mission, this however you want to phrase it, um, that's defining by her character and her past choices and not being perfect.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing too that I want to kind of talk to you
Mhm.
a little bit about, and I know you've talked about it before, was your setting of that book not being set really in a specific time. Like that whole book, I was sitting there wondering, I'm like, okay, well, we're getting text messages, so it's got to be sometime in the somewhat, present, but it could also be the future. Like that really blew my mind. Did you always know that you were going to leave it like that, or was that something that you kind of figured out along the way?
I love this question so hard, and the reason is because this was a huge source of um I don't know, I fought a lot on this. And I have a
Yeah.
great editor, but we fought about this. And I never wanted the specific time to be established
Yeah.
because my argument to Gemma, my editor, was when women have equal rights then I'll start dating my stories about women. But
There
until
you go.
then, but until then, I'm going to leave it ambiguous because the story it remains relevant. And so you can gather that, like you said, like it's either modern or near future. And
Yeah.
I want it to be either modern or near future for the foreseeable future because we're still there. We're moving backwards in a lot of ways. And
Yeah.
so the story is relevant that way. I didn't want someone to read this story and not connect it to our present time because if I dated it and I had it happen in the 1950s, people will go, "Oh, it was bad back then. Thank God I'm
Yeah.
living now." I wanted people to think about it right now. So if you do the addition, like when Hollyhock opened, the years it sat empty, but blah, blah, you could kind of get yourself into um, the middle of this century.
Hmm.
So it's somewhere in there. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great question, and I that was very intentional.
Yeah. It felt intentional, but it's also one of those things that I felt like as the world turns, you're like, how what year is it really? And so it's
Yeah,
something that as the story progresses, I feel like it could add, that depth or that almost like a warning, like
yeah,
this is also where we're heading, if we keep up, this is where we're going.
yeah,
We're going back to the
yeah.
future kind of thing.
hmm
But yeah, no, it's an incredible book, and I really recommend it to everybody. And it's one of those books that I kind of recommend sometimes with caution because I do think it hits really, really hard. So it's something that hit very emotionally for me, as a woman living in the year 2024, whenever it came out, now
Yeah.
25. But I think that you set out and achieved everything that you had hoped to with that book. I mean, I love it to
Thank
death.
you. Thank you so
Um,
much.
yeah, of course. And then I want to switch gears a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
The most recent thing that I've read from you is a little chapbook called Death on the Swayback, and it came out with Rapture Publishing. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that whole
Yeah.
project of working with Rapture because you are also the illustrator for Rapture as of now. And I love all of the illustrations that I get in my little chapbooks. So can you talk a little bit about partnering with Mitch and the whole project? And then, of
Yeah.
course, we'll get to your story a little bit after we
No,
talk
that's
about that.
fine. Sure, sure. I will literally talk about anything. So, um, uh, Tyler Jones last summer saw a video Clay McLeod Chapman did on TikTok where he was holding up a drawing I did for him. So
Yeah,
I did a drawing for Clay based on his book What Kind of Mother.
I remember that.
That same day I get a text from Tyler or a DM or whatever saying, "Hey, I've got a story coming out later in the year. Could you do the cover for it?" I was like, "Sure." And then we did like a Zoom call, me and Tyler and Mitch, who runs Rapture. We talked about what it would look like and some interior designs. I drew those. And then in the meantime, Mitch, who's like, he's um he's one of these people for whom the barrier of 24 hours per day does not apply, I don't
It's
think.
what it seems.
Yeah, because the amount of stuff he does and then the quality with which he does it is kind of astonishing. And he like wrote me and said, "Oh my God, I read Redemption of Morgan Bright. I really loved it." And he goes, "Do you have any like short stuff?" And I had just written what became Death on This Way Back, and it was originally called Seed the Forest, but Death on This Way Back is way better. Um, and so I sent it to him and I was like, look, man, it's kind of a weird, it's like forest horror. It's a very sort of slowly oppressive kind of story. It's not a bunch of action. So, if it's not for you, that's fine. And he wrote back, he was like, I want to publish this. So that's kind of what happened. And I was like, do you want me to do the drawings for it? He's like, yeah. And then we pretty much I had lots of conversations with him about kind of the direction he wanted to take Rapture. And it's been really cool because he's like, I'm thinking of doing X, Y, or Z. Like, what do you think about that? And so he'll run his ideas by me um and I give him my feedback and then he does what he's gonna do. And um we were talking about, well, look, if you're gonna put these things out regularly, you know, maybe start coming up with a numbering system for them, an annual way to organize them. And if I'm doing all the art, we'll do it in a uniform way. So like the lettered versions he does, the art goes all the way to the edge of the paper. The numbered versions have a frame, and sometimes the art kind of sticks out of the frame. So it's a neat little duality you've got there. And yeah, and so like there's a bunch more coming up, and I have a meeting tomorrow with another one of his authors and him about that art. And I just love it. I love the idea of you have all these different stories, but there's this continuity of the feel of the art. And I think it kind of, when people go, "Oh, this is clearly a book from Del Rey, or this is clearly an Angry Robot book or whatever," you can know you're reading a Rapture book, just from the art and then of course who he's picking to write stories for him.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I love like from a business side of it, the marketing
Mhm.
side of it, much like the things that you talked about. It's very identifiable.
Yeah.
It's like it's oddly very niche, but it is so well done and thought out to like much like you said with every illustration having its own little significant thing between the lettered and the numbered editions and things like that. It's really impressive to me from the outside and it came together. It seemed pretty quickly and like we were getting,
Yeah.
copies of these and I'm obsessed with them. But more particularly your story, Death on the Sway Back. Do you want to talk a little bit about the inspiration for that story? And I think that there's a certain voice and an atmosphere that you use in that story that is very unique. And so I'm curious if you had like any way to like channel that in your mind whenever you sat down to read it, because it feels a bit different than the Redemption of Morgan Bright.
Oh yeah, it's the voice is like totally different. I mean, is it, I am just experimenting like anybody else and trying to find what works. And I do when I'm writing, very much visualize everything. Like I'm a visual person first, and so I am visualizing this main character who has no name until the very end. You learn his name, but visualizing this character trudging up a mountain. Now, I've spent a lot of time, doing hiking and camping and all of that. So I have a really visceral feel for how it sounds and how it looks and how it feels. And and then this is probably kind of cheap. Like to get the voice, I kind of will, this takes place a few decades after the Civil War. And so I will drop out any words that I think of as kind of modern words. Um, and I'll simplify some things. I'll put them in like a parlance.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, something as simple as, felling trees.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is what they're doing. And I'm sure that lumberjacks even today talk about felling trees, but it's a phrase we don't hear all the time. And the way
Yeah.
he says it, um, or the way he thinks about it seems just kind of old timey. And there's a little like I sprinkle like a little pepper of things of the time,
Mm-hmm.
like, the little cornbread cakes he makes every morning and stuff. And that, of course, was just research. I was like, what the fuck
Yeah.
did pioneers eat during this time, right? And I found what they ate, and then I just made it sound really, just regular. This is what you do. And then a couple of the like I knew wild onions, I knew about ramps, but I couldn't tell you if I've ever seen wild onions called ramps.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was another way to do it, of just sort of introduce something that just was a little bit oblique off of what we're used to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so to kind of set that shift back a little bit and without overpowering with all
Yeah.
of this stuff of the era, just to give the reader a feel of, oh, I'm in another time right now. So
Yeah. Well,
that's kind of what I did.
yeah, it's a very fine balance of, wanting to be specific to what you're imagining in your head and, conveying that atmosphere and time and setting and all that kind of stuff. But then, like you said, like the overwhelming aspect, if you start switching the context and vernacular to like all of these things that nobody has ever heard of,
Right.
then it becomes like, how do you read this? But no, I feel like it walks the line of being a story that we could tell now,
Yeah.
obviously, and being a story of the past. And it was odd, it was like a very kind of folksy read. Like it made me think of like folk horror tales, cautionary tales, things like that. I really,
Mhm.
really enjoyed it. And I would say like it's environmental horror. Like I would,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
it makes me think of Daniel Krause's Pay the Piper. Like those, for some
Mhm.
reason, your
I
story in
haven't
that
read that
one.
yet. I haven't read that yet, so I have to read that. But it is
Yeah.
definitely environmental horror. I mean, it is about trees.
Yes.
It is about revenge. Um, and it is about, respecting the environment. But you hopefully you don't really realize that's what it's all about until that's what it's all about.
Oh, no, 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 no. And you leave it on a very memorable note. So like you're not really missing the point at the end there. I'll just say that. No, I really enjoyed it. And this is a bit of a broader question, but you mentioned that your shorter fiction has always kind of leaned more horror than compared to maybe some of your longer things. Is there an approach that you take to writing short fiction that's very different from your longer fiction? Because I've talked to a few authors about this, and like for instance, when I talked to Nat Cassidy about it, he relates writing shorter fiction to like almost like telling a joke. Like sometimes you got to be like depending on the story, sometimes you got to land a punch and things like that. And then other people are like, well, sometimes I just set out to tell a story and it's a short story, and then sometimes it spins out into something more. So I'm kind of curious how that process works for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I am very premise oriented. So sometimes, you know, a premise like take Morgan Bright. The premise is a woman assumes a false identity to have herself committed to an institution to find out why her sister died there. That's not a short story, right? Um, you know, The Phlebotomist is my debut, and that's about a society, a near future dystopian society segregated by blood type. You could tell a granular story out of that world, but if you want to tell that whole story, that's not a short story.
Yeah.
So generally, it's the premise. I'm not necessarily on the lookout for a short story premise or a novel premise.
Hmm.
If I come up with a premise, I'll go, oh, that's probably over here. And and I'll tell you, like right now, I have three or four premises just sitting in Word documents on my desktop that have one or two sentences or maybe a couple of pages.
Hmm.
And I know those are short stories. And um and so I think Nat's thinking about it as a joke is really apt.
Hmm.
But when I am trying to write a piece of short fiction, if I've got a premise that is a pretty tight premise, I think of it more as a trebuchet.
Yeah.
In other words, the premise is the trebuchet, and it's going to have a trajectory, and this premise is tight enough that the trajectory is 10 pages
Yeah.
instead of 100,000 words. Um, and sometimes I just know, like, like I have a story. Sometimes the premise is something I've heard. Like I have a story right now. I won't say the title just because I really dig the title and I want it to actually be a story before I like talk about it.
Yeah.
But it's about a guy who places ads to basically be abused. So people can call it and he will go there and be. It's not like a Dom sub thing. He's sort of a philosopher in the sense that he wants to see where people will go if they really know they can go there. And then
Yeah.
and then then he judges them for it.
Oh,
And
that's
yeah,
interesting.
so but that's probably a 10 to 20 page story.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that will be one that I try to sub or I save for a short story collection or something like that. But most often I just see the angle of launch, whether it's a catapult or a trebuchet or a gun or whatever you want to say. I like trebuchets. I think they're super cool. I want one in my backyard. Um, and I just see the trajectory. Once I know the premise, I'm like, okay, this feels like a shorter or a longer trajectory.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's a good visual for it too, I mean, and I do feel like sometimes even though short stories span, physical span and word count is, whatever, I feel like it has the potential to go the distance as
Mhm.
the same way as a novel does. It's just sometimes it's the formatting, there are certain short stories that have stuck with me just as long as a novel would. So it's really interesting to hear authors talk about their approach to it because to me, on the outside as a reader, it just feels so different,
Mhm.
whenever you have room to, because in my head, I think about it as like having the room to breathe and really flesh things out versus like, okay, we need to be efficient and we need to not waste word count and we need to get this information across and get from A to B in the most effective and efficient way as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's really funny actually is Death on the Swayback. When I started, I was like, oh, this is a novella.
Hmm.
I was wrong about the trajectory on this one. I was totally wrong. And I started going and I had probably like 35 pages written. And I was like, you are just stalling to get to a page count, Chris.
Yeah.
This is not a novella. It's a short story. And I chopped it down. See, totally unintended. See, it just comes naturally. I chopped it down and got rid of where I was just sort of treading water. And I was like, okay, now I feel like it's an effective short story. But that one, that's a great example. That's one where I thought this was like a novella and I was going to go try to sell this novella.
Yeah.
But I was like, no, it's not. It's a short story.
Well, I think it's a really important kind of skill to have that as an author to know that about your work. Like to know when, okay, well, maybe this isn't, what I planned and to say to chop it down. To be able to
Yeah,
give the story the space that it deserves in the end, if you, whether it's, the long treatment or the shorter treatment. I feel like
yeah.
that's a really hard skill to kind of refine because I would imagine I'm somebody who like I used to paint and draw, so like and this is about to segue to my artist questions for you, but sometimes when you're given the space to breathe and create and do all this, like you want to overindulge and you want to,
Mm.
but then there is the time when you like sometimes the logistic reasons or whatever you have to dial it back. So I think knowing that is a really important skill to have, you know?
Well, for better or worse, you know, I'm not going to say nothing I've written is self-indulgent. Sometimes I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe people will or have read things I've written and gone, ugh, so self-indulgent. Um, but I have this like ticking clock in my head, and when I'm writing, it's always going. And if I'm in a scene and that scene is not working, and I've like kind of gone two or three paragraphs, I I I have this alarm bell that goes off and it's like, no, back up.
Yeah.
This is not this isn't what would happen here. This you're just you've wandered off the path. And
Hmm.
that has saved me a lot of time and trouble, I think, where I don't get too lost. And I think what the reason I said for better or worse is I do think I have the audience in mind.
Hmm.
And whether or not they're going to be engaged, I have that thing kind of running in the background. So I can't say that I'm only writing for me because I am trying to write something. I am writing for me, and I do love what I write. Um, I wrote a very angry book with the Redemption of Morgan Bright because I was angry.
Yeah.
Um, and I wasn't going, oh, well, this upset people because I didn't care. But as far as whether or not the reader is at the root of it, like staying engaged, are they entertained? I always have that kind of clock running. And so
Yeah.
I kind of feel when I'm at the edge of the rope on that, and I'm like, I don't think it's working. I'll back up a page and take another direction. Um, so so I tend to be pretty attuned to that.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
that's a really interesting way to think about it, and like kind of getting the feel for it, like the structure of the story. And are you somebody who plots everything out, like outlines to the whatever degree, or are you just kind of this kind I feel like I know the answer to this, but if you just said, like you write and you feel like, oh, we got to walk it back, you kind of like let it flow as it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a complete pantser, right?
Yeah.
Totally. I don't outline now. The exception will be once I'm into a book and I go, okay, well, I know it's got to get here at the end, but a lot of little things have to happen. I
Hmm.
will then sit down and map them out.
Yeah.
So like Redemption of Morgan Bright, that one was really hard because I I I pantsed the whole thing, but I had, transcript sections, prose sections, text sections, illustrations, newspaper articles, and I had to like slot them in to
Yeah.
into the right places to reveal what I wanted to reveal when I wanted to reveal it, while also not having, 20 blocks of prose chapters and then a bunch of text and then, I
Yeah.
wanted to uh, divide it up and change it up enough so the reader stayed engaged. But mostly I'm a pantser. I did write a dark fantasy novel, which doesn't have a home yet, but might. I'll let you know if I get that home. But it's kind of relevant to what we've talked about today. That book is 530 pages.
Ooh.
I don't know where that came from, but it's a dark fantasy, a very dark fantasy. I wrote it 3 times.
Oh, wow.
And and I'm generally an impatient person, but I pantsed it the first time and
Hmm.
I was like, nope, it's not, it didn't go the right direction. I pantsed it the second time, it got closer, and then the third time I knew what it was because it was such a sprawling story, and I utterly love it. Um, but we'll see if it finds the light of day. We'll see.
Yeah. No, well, I want to know about it if it does, but it's an
I'll
interesting
talk to you after.
process.
I'll talk to you afterwards, okay?
Okay, okay.
I'll tell
Um,
you.
Perfect. No, and it's always interesting whenever you go, and I can't help but think about, Jonathan Jantz has talked about it, but I think he was quoting King whenever he's talked about it. The idea that you're like unearthing the story in your head, right? Like
Yeah.
the story has always been there, but it's about, for lack of better words, like kind of like an architectural or archaic dig where you're like unearthing the fossil of the story and you gotta like find the right pieces, to it. And you know, whenever you write as you go, I feel like that's the best way to do it because I feel like even writing the wrong thing can be cathartic and give you the confidence to know like this is the right thing rather than like sticking to, and I'm not condemning or praising one way or the other. I mean, like everybody's got to do the way that they got to do it. I mean,
Yeah.
but whenever I feel like whenever you write as you go, and even if you write the wrong thing, there's a certain knowing in that, okay, yeah, that was the wrong thing, and we can scratch that off the list and move on,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
You dig in the wrong direction, you dig too deep, nothing's there. I
Yeah.
I look, I don't understand outliners. I
Yeah.
do, I and I don't understand them in the best way, which I mean what I mean by that is I don't I cannot conceive
Yeah.
of the brain power that it takes to outline a book and get it right. Now I know they have editing and everything, but to outline a book from start to finish before you write it and anticipate those character decisions and happy accidents.
Yeah.
Like I come across so many like happy accidents when I'm pantsing. And I'm sure that authors who outline, even those who are rigorously outline, I'm sure they if they're going along and they're like, oh, like this character really actually needs to do this. I'm sure they follow what is best for the story.
Yeah.
But the idea to me, I do not know the whole story when I sit down to write. I know the premise, I know the trajectory, and often I know the ending.
Yeah.
I always knew how the Redemption of Morgan Bright was going to end.
Yeah.
Um, some of my other ones, I don't know exactly how they're going to end, but can see the threads sort of coming together. And I'm like, I'll work it out. Like
Yeah.
I'll find the correct ending for the threads I've got going. But that's the closest I really get to straight up outlining. So outliners are like, they're like I want to go on an outliner safari, right? Where you're on the top of like a truck and there's a guide and you've got telescopes and there's like outliners in the wild. And they're like, look over there, there's whoever it is. And they've got a big chalkboard or, post-its on a wall. and and you go, oh my God, I've heard about them. Ah, you look over there and they're like spilling their tea and drawing, tacking strings to a board. I don't know. Sorry.
I feel like you need to create that visually now. Oh God, I would love to have a painting of that in my house because that's so funny.
Outliner safari.
Yeah, Outlier Safari. No,
You
I
catch one and bring it home.
try to harness the power. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
um, yeah, and I feel like stories that are really logically driven. Like I get outlining for like let's say like a murder mystery story, like a thriller, like a straight up procedural. To me, that makes so much sense because you can't work a
Yes.
case from like I mean, I guess you can, but but that's, not lofty space. That's facts that you gotta, follow. But to me, whenever you get into like sci-fi, horror, fantasy, the more emotive like subgenres and even like, whatever variety of contemporary fiction that you're picking up these days. I mean, to me, it just feels like you kind of got to let it flow at some point. Like you kind of
Yeah,
got to let it go and see where it goes.
totally. However, I will say that never underestimate the power of going back and planting something. And that's the thing, like, you'll hear somebody say, well, like, how did you make this tiny thing that was so
Yeah.
innocuous early in the book? How did you make that the big thing that worked? And I was like, well, I went back and put it there, right?
Yeah.
That's how I did it,
You can do
right?
that. Yeah.
Later in the book, if I don't feel something is hitting hard enough, or I don't feel that a reveal is strong enough, or the penny drop moment is penny drop enough, penny droppy enough, I will go and I will change the setup a little bit
Yeah.
to sort of load the spring, and then the spring goes off later. But that's the magic of editing is if I feel like this moment needs to be bigger, I can always load it
Yeah.
harder and set that tension more earlier on. I mean, the book that I'm editing right now is it's going to come out in 2026, and there's a lot of family dynamics.
Hmm.
And those family dynamics have to ring true. And in the context of the story, I need them to have some big results. And so I am literally going from like one early part of the story to a later part of the story, and I'm turning those dials so that the reaction we get later makes sense based on what happened earlier.
Yeah.
Um, and I heard someone, I think it was on Talking Scared. I heard Neil talking with an author. It's the most recent one. I forget her name. But
Oh, was it Sophie White? Was that?
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Sophie White. And she's talking about how she's basically a pantser, and that she always surprises herself with these little nuggets that she will have left, and then they become important later and she can use them later. I find that all the time. And there's a
Yeah.
bunch of them in The Redemption of Morgan Bright.
Hmm.
There's a bunch. Um, of these like innocuous details that become big later. So it's all about, going, hey, like when the book comes out, yes, it's a linear book. You go from A to B, but it wasn't when I was writing it. Like I can mess with time and space before you get the book. And that's why some things that seem really, really smart are me later just going, this right now is just sort of a story that goes from A to Z and it's whatever. And if I need a harder twist or I need a bigger reveal, well, I could make that happen by doing things earlier or using some things that I've already given myself. They were just sitting there. I didn't know how to use them.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's an oddly reassuring kind of concept, I feel like, to subscribe to because the fact that you can write a story in its entirety doesn't mean that it's done. Like
Correct.
of course you know that there's editing. Of course that is
Mhm.
there. But to have like that very specific example of like, oh, we'll just go and add the thing to make it better, like it's an oddly reassuring notion. And that's really
Well,
funny that you say it like that because I don't know that I had ever considered it quite like that either.
yeah. Well, I will say this, and I think another thing that for anyone who's writing, and they go, God, the stuff I read is so intricate and well planned and everything makes sense. And then I'm writing and mine doesn't feel that way. Well, it shouldn't feel that way in your first draft. It's not, yeah, I guarantee you it didn't feel that way in the first draft of that book you're reading.
Yeah.
The I have said many times when I'm asked about this, I've said, and I continue to say because it is the truth, and I think it is potentially good for other writers to hear, is that I don't know my characters or really what the book is about until I'm done writing it,
Yeah.
until I'm done. And then I go, okay, I think I know what this book is about. I think I know who these characters are. And then I go back to the beginning and I write what I now know. And
Yeah.
so those characters, they take on real shape in the
Hmm.
revisions. And the plot takes on the real depth and tension. And I'm turning those dials in the revisions.
Yeah.
It's not the first draft. I've written some dog shit first drafts that I thought were pretty good. And my friends are like, can I be honest with you? I'm like, are we still friends? And they're like, maybe not. But it's all the revision for me. I mean, watching it really blossom in revision is like my favorite thing to do as a
Yeah.
writer. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really unique perspective, and I'm glad that we've talked about it because, I feel like I've talked about the writing process with quite a few authors, and, everybody has their way of doing it, but I think that this is one of the first times that I've heard somebody speak so highly of like the editing process. And
Yeah.
it's really unique to see how it works for everybody. I mean, everybody's mind's
Yeah.
different, like the way that it works, but I think that it's a for somebody who like me who has anxiety, whenever you do create, and this applies to artwork as well, as
Yeah.
like, I'm not sure if you've ever had that moment whenever you're like drawing or painting something and you're like shit, 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 shit the whole entire time.
Yeah.
And then it's like whether you commit or you back off and reevaluate,
Mhm.
but there is editing for that reason.
Yeah. I don't think that visual art, as far as producing it, is any different from writing. I think they're the
Yeah.
exact same. They both have an ugly phase. And you just have to remind yourself, look, if I push through this and I revise if it's writing or I refine if it's visual, I will get to where I want to go. And often with writing, I think it's often harder because when I am writing, if I'm drafting a new thing, I've
Hmm.
just come off the thing before. And
Right.
the thing I've just finished is now super polished and it's ready to go and it feels like a book. And then I start writing again and it's super dumb. And it's super dumb and it's stupid and it sounds stupid and it is stupid and it looks stupid. And I have to just go, Chris, this will get there. Like just push through. It will get there. And I have to remind myself with that with art too, all the
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really funny because you inadvertently answered a literal written question that I had right here, which is how you think about, your relationship with creation in terms of art, physical media, your painting,
Yeah.
drawing, all that good stuff, and fiction. But again, you just kind of answered that.
Well,
Um,
they definitely click different boxes. I can definitely I can do visual art in a much more meditative
yeah,
kind of therapeutic way. Um, because yes, I'll be thinking about it, and yes, I'm thinking about composition and color and all of that. But writing is so much more energy.
oh yeah,
And so I do have a very different relationship with them. But fundamentally, I think carrying one from inception to conclusion is the same process, I think.
yeah. I think that that creative resiliency is like the nugget. Is that what
Yes.
makes you a successful creative is being able to be resilient in that way and not getting discouraged too.
I
Yeah.
love that. I love that. That's such a perfect way of putting it. And you really have to have creative resiliency these days because you're bombarded on like I'm on Instagram and like I'm
Oh yeah.
scrolling in bed at night and I'm scrolling. I'm like, I should fucking quit. Like there's so and the truth is this. There are some artists I will never be as good as you. And all I can do is say bravo, like what you're doing is amazing, and I can be inspired by it and try
Yeah.
not to get discouraged by it. But sometimes I'm just like, screw this and throw my phone onto the floor and, weep myself to sleep.
Oh no, I totally understand that.
Yeah.
And I find that your art, it's a lot of pen and ink that you do, correct?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
yeah. It that art form, whew, is that meticulous? But I understand what you say whenever you kind of reach that meditative state sometimes, whenever you're
Yeah.
doing stuff like that, because it is a lot of repetitive motion and like stippling, line
Yeah.
work, cross hatching, all that kind of stuff. But how would you say that you refine your style as an artist? Because there are times whenever I'm scrolling on Instagram and I see somebody's book cover or like you share something and I see it without like even seeing your name and I'm like, oh, that's Chris's. Like you have a
Um,
very distinct art style. So like how did you refine that? Like is that something that you intentionally have worked towards or is this just like your niche now?
that's it. That's such a great question because it's been a battle for me because I have some very strong influences.
Mm-hmm.
And um so much of my artistic journey has been trying to do more of what what they have done, these other artists,
Yeah.
to try to create the effects that they've created, been sometimes successful in going, okay, I've mastered that look.
Mm-hmm.
And then other times going, well, every time I get close, mine looks like something different. And it was funny, I had some art prints at this tattoo shop here in Dallas where I've gotten some work done, and I was giving them some prints, and they were like, "Oh man, like I love this, blah blah blah," and I was like, "Yeah, but I really every time I try to do this, it looks like this," and this guy goes, he goes, "Chris, that's your style.
Yeah.
Like whether you like it or not." That's your style. You can always try to like change it if you want, but you're probably not really gonna. You've drawn enough where that's what it looks like, whether you like it or not. And um, so I've had some influences like I love Art Nouveau,
Mm-hmm.
love just love Art Nouveau, and I have gone from, and then there's some album artists. There's an artist named John Baisley who is the lead singer of the band Baroness,
Mm-hmm.
and it was him who I was first emulating when I started.
Yeah.
He has a very colorful, flowy Art Nouveau um, sort of aesthetic, and with skulls and like women and flowers, and it's very Art Nouveau, you
Yeah.
know. And then mine has sort of drifted kind of from there to more of an illustrative story, kind of a story feel, and less of a statement feel, less of just an icon feel.
Yeah.
Um, and so, like uh, I did V. Castro's last cover for the Pink Agave Hotel,
Mm-hmm.
Motel. And I read they wanted a cover based on the big novella inside. And so I read that,
Right.
and I'm trying to tell a story with that cover. But what I've noticed is that like I'm super metal, okay? Just
Yeah.
I know you can't tell. I'm very dad right now, but I'm so metal you don't even know, okay?
Yeah.
And I listen to like some of the most extreme stuff you've ever heard. And my problem is that while my spirit is so black, it's so black, I cannot help but color in like these bright rainbow,
Yeah.
luscious, gorgeous colors. And I'm like, I can't help it. Whenever
Yeah.
I try to go mute with it, I'm like, what would look good here if I put some hot pink in? You know, how metal is that? It's so unmetal. It's like super extreme metal.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Um, and so yeah, it's gone like really colorful and vibrant. And I think that's where I think I'm kind of running at a trot now as far as
Mhm.
my style goes. It is, even after doing it, professionally for like 15 plus years, it is now really kind of taking on a look,
Yeah.
you know? And I just think that's just time and repetition, probably.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, but I get that, but also it's so funny because you do have very vibrant work, and like I've seen whenever you share your digital art, the thing on I think you use Procreate whenever
Yeah.
you can show that layer of the color that you add.
Yeah.
It's like I always know whenever whenever you start showing, I'm like, oh, we're about to get bright.
Yep,
But
yep.
but I love it. No, and it's such a recognizable signature, and then kind of the that's more of like your bigger art pieces, but as you've done illustrations for like, like you mentioned for fiction related things, and then particularly for the Rapture publishing. Like, what is how is that process whenever you read a story? Like, do you know whenever you're reading, like, this is the scene that I'm going to illustrate? Or is like, do you get asked, like, hey, can you illustrate this scene? Or like, I'm thinking in particular of Brian Evanson's recent Brothers
Yeah.
Keeper, like the
Oh,
illustration that was
did you see the one in back? The There's one in there that's pretty dark.
that's the one that I'm like, I'm kind of wondering, like, did they ask for that, or did you just like you feel it out and you're like, okay, this is the one, and I want to know, like, how do you know? Like, is it just a feeling, or is there like, I don't know. I'm just so curious how you land on those.
Well, I mean, like for Evanson's, there is a thing that happens at the end. There is a scene he paints, and I'm like, I can't not draw that.
No, you
Like
can't not
that's
see
the
that,
yeah,
honestly. Yeah.
it's the apex of the story,
Hmm.
and it should come along with a little drawing. And it was funny because I was talking to Mitch about usually we're very like simpatico on what we're gonna do. So I said, I think the cover is like the two brothers as if they're kind of coming out of a mirror because they're kind of
Yeah.
living in this mirror image. I think I'm just going to have them kind of stepping out of these two mirrors and kind of considering each other and kind of looking pretty ragged and like shit. And and then there's the blueprint because the house, the layout is so
Right.
important.
Yes.
Which we actually had Evanson draw on like a napkin and send
I
a
was about to,
picture,
I was gonna say it had to
right?
be that Brian had to have a hand in that because his
He had
description
to.
is so to the T, and then,
Yeah. I wanted to make sure I had it right. So
yeah.
I had my idea for what it looked like. His idea was a little different.
Me
And
too. When
so,
I pictured it a certain way in my head, and then
mhm,
whenever I saw it, I was like, oh, I was close, but not quite.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's his overall layout as he
Yeah.
drew it. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do like a paint can blueprint. Here's the cover. And then I was like, I think I'm going to do the thing at the end. And um, oh, actually, you know what? I didn't tell Mitch I was going to do that. I sent it to him. I just drew it and sent it to him.
That's
And I think
perfect.
his text back was just like fuck like that, you know.
Ah,
Uh and so far it's been just like that where I mean with Carved in Salt, Tyler's book, the imagery, again, this is all a credit to these authors because they're giving us such good imagery. It's not hard for me to pick something out.
yeah.
And there's some coming up that I'm just like, I think this is the cover, I think this is an interior, or this and this, and then we'll come up with a little doodad for the page numbers.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So far it's worked out really well, and Mitch and I are in love. Um,
That's awesome.
yeah, and it's just been a super cool partnership.
Yeah, I love whenever you get a creative collaboration. Whew, that was a tongue twister. Um, like that, and it works so well because the
Yes.
product is great. But I do love that you sent it to him, no context. Just
Yeah, yeah.
here you go. Yeah, there.
Yeah. I think I was like, wait, I was like, I got something. Wait till you see this.
That's perfect. Oh, that's brilliant. I love
That's
it.
one of the most disturbing things I've drawn, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I could see why.
Yeah.
No, that's really great. Chris, thank you so much for your time. We're
Yeah, you
running, I
bet.
think, a little bit over an hour now at this
Oh, that's
point,
okay.
but I do want to go ahead and give you a space to talk about what you have going on this year. Like I said, I just read Death on the Sway Back. That came out at the end of, like, very tail end of 2024 with Rapture
Hmm.
Publishing. But what does 2025 look like for you? I know that you mentioned that you have something that's probably coming out in 26, but and I know that you're doing a Talking Scared series with Neil and Nat Cassidy about the Dark Tower, which I'd love to talk to you a little bit about. But
Yeah, let's
what
do.
what else is going on?
Well, you know, publishing, especially with novels, is so like unpredictable and long and all
Yes.
of that. Like, I would love to get into the habit of putting out a novel a year.
Yeah.
I certainly write enough to put out a novel a year. That's not happened so far. The first three were 2020, 2022, 2024, and now my next one's 2026.
Yeah.
But it is a two book deal. So the one after that will be 2027. So
Nice.
I'll have them coming out in a row. This year, I am. I'm gonna be working on, I hope, releasing another book, which I'll talk to you about afterwards. And then a lot of short fiction, I think. I think I'm gonna
Yeah.
be trying to pump out some more short fiction. Like I told you, how all these like little just doodads on my desktop with these ideas, and I think a lot of them could really do something. I'm struggling with a YA horror novel that I really love, but I'm having some. My agent is saying that she's not quite hearing the voice yet,
Hmm.
which is fine. I'm reading more YA, so I'm trying to get that voice without being fake, which
Yeah.
is very tough to do. It's a very specific voice. So
Yeah.
that's just a challenge I'm working through. Um, but yeah, so I mean, I'll probably, if I had to guess, I will probably finish 2 books this year and have nowhere to put them, just because this the publishing schedule is so crazy. But I do really like about horror, and I think I will be embracing very soon is look, it's lovely to, have your books come out with big distribution. And that's what I get from Angry Robot. Like Angry Robot, they're available everywhere. My
Mhm.
books have lots of distribution. You can go to a bookstore. It's probably going to be there. Um, Not always so with indies.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, I look around and horror is very unique because I can look around at all these other authors who have traditional deals, indie deals, self-pub deals, whatever. And I'm like, I don't need to be so precious about, a book I write and go, oh, this only can come out if it's traditional and I don't want to go indie or whatever. I've already got some stuff out to some indies. I'm going to keep leaning into that because, as far as I'm concerned, if you got stories to tell, tell them, get them out there, and people could find them. And indies, okay, they don't have distribution. People aren't going to happen upon it at every bookstore. But we've got some really, really amazing indies right now, and
We
I want to be
do.
a part of them. And I have no shame in saying that, like, eventually, I really want to have a Clash book. I really want to have a shortwave book. I want
Yeah.
to have a Sobolo book. I want to have a Bad Hand book. I want to have a Raw Dog Screaming Press book, right? Um, and I certainly write enough
Yeah.
to hopefully be able to do that and give them something that they feel they want to publish. So I think this year's going to be a lot of writing.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. The I want to touch on the YA thing. YA to me is such an interesting, unique beast because you cannot sit here and tell me that, we are marketing freaking Akatara, the A Court of Thorns, Roses, whatever the shit it is,
Yes.
as YA, and then it gets down to like horror, and you're like, we gotta tone down the violence. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what? No, I have a huge belief system in this, but I get where the voice thing with YA is so unique because there are adult stories, like traditionally published horror stories that have younger protagonists that have a YA feel to them, but they are not marketed as YA
Yep.
because of the violence or the gore or whatever.
Mhm.
It's a strange little line that gets drawn with YA, but
It really is. And from a stylistic point of view, when I first started this one, I had a lot of internalization because I'm like, well, this person, something big happens at the beginning, and she's like, what's happening to me? Why did this happen? Blah 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 blah. All the questions you'd ask.
yeah,
Now, if and my agent was like, no, 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 take all that out because the reader will think those things. I'm like, that's a great point. The reader
yeah.
will think those things. But then, but then I gave it back to her. She's like, I'm still not finding it. And I have a great agent. She's very honest with me.
Hmm.
And so I'm always like, I'm very coachable. I'm like, okay, let's try again. Let's try
Yeah,
again. But then I had other people look at it and they're like, where's all the internalization? Wouldn't she be going, what's happening to me? Yada yada. And I'm like, I took all that out. So again, this is a journey. I'm fine with it because I don't have a book coming out this year. I have a whole list that I sourced from Blue Sky
yeah.
of YA horror. I've started to read more of it, and
Hmm.
hopefully I can find whatever that mysterious voice is that is missing. Um, Again, I think so much of it also is framing. If you're told you're reading a YA book, you read
It
it as
is,
more
yeah.
YA,
I
right?
agree. I totally
Yeah.
agree with that
Yep.
100%. Yeah.
Yep.
That it's just it, and I far be it from me. I am not an expert. I can't tell you the last time I read something YA. I think like the next YA thing I'm gonna read is actually an old R.L. Stein book a
Mhm.
Fear Street book. But I mean, I'm not the expert on YA, but just from an outsider perspective, it seems like such a unique um beast is like the word that I can only think of it because there's
Yeah.
so many like kind of like criteria, but not criteria. I don't know. You know what I mean.
Yeah. 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 And I gotta tell you, I mean, the last YA book I read was White Smoke by Tiffany Jackson.
Yeah.
And and it's a super creepy haunted house kind of book. Uh, but like you go, okay, what is the line? Because there's there's plenty of cursing, there's plenty
Yeah.
of like sex adjacent, it's teenage stuff. Um, the main character is like constantly on the lookout for weed for her anxiety. And I'm like, this is just an adult book with like young characters. I don't understand
No,
why it's, you know, I
that's
get
very
it's
much how
about the
I feel about it.
protagonist, right?
Yeah.
I get it's about the protagonist, but you're right. Like sometimes you've got a teen protagonist, but it's a quote adult book. And I don't know why. And then like some people are like, look, the YA books often go way harder than the adult books.
They do no, they do like in my experience, they do.
Yeah.
It's I again, it's just a weird I mean, like, and the biggest example of that to me is like the Hunger Games. I mean, because that
Uh-huh.
defined my childhood reading was like that, or my like high school reading was the Hunger Games. And I mean, that is it. Whew, it's brutal. There's nothing that
Yeah.
they don't touch on in that.
Yeah.
But that's still classified as a younger
Yeah.
audience. So yeah, that's a whole other, I need to probably educate myself more on this before I start talking about it. But
Well,
no.
when I figure it out, I'll let you know.
Yeah, sounds sounds good. And then the last thing I want to talk to you about really quick is what it's been like with reading The Dark Tower and how that's been going for you.
Yeah.
I haven't read The Dark Tower yet. I plan on joining you all and y'all's read along very soon. If I can ever get through my list of arcs that I absolutely must get through. But what's it been like? Like, has it exceeded your expectations? Has it been exactly what you expected? Like how's it been?
Well, it's kind of intimidating because, the whole setup is I'm coming on there as the dipshit who's never read Stephen King.
Yeah,
And being basically paired up with two college professors of it.
I
Uh,
know. Yeah,
and so it's been fun. The dynamic's really fun. Like those guys are utterly great, and it is fun every time. I'll take a guess at something,
yeah,
and they'll either smirk or they'll giggle to themselves, and it's really fun that way. And so for anyone who's reading it for the first time, um, you know, listeners can kind of experience that too, right?
yeah,
And so it's been a ton of fun, and I apparently my reaction to the gunslinger was atypical. Apparently, people who have read a lot of King tend to not like the gunslinger as much as the other books.
yeah,
Whereas I was like head over heels for the gunslinger because I'd never read anything close to it.
yeah,
Like it was so different. It was oddly disjointed, but not in like a bad way. Um, there was a lot of freedom to how he was writing it, and I just utterly loved it. The
hmm,
drawing of the three I also enjoyed, but not as much as Gunslinger, although there are some sections of drawing of the three that are just so bonkers that
yeah,
you're like, I'm so excited I'm reading this, you know?
yeah,
And I think that episode comes out in like a month or something, and then we're going to record The Wastelands next. But he's doing it at such an easy pace that it's
yeah,
not a big, it's not a big hassle. I mean, I do have to dive into the Wastelands here soon because I take notes and stuff. Because
yeah,
again, look, Anna, I'm completely out of my depth here. Okay. Like, uh, these guys, like Nat Cassidy will regale you with like which edition came out in which year and which like men's magazine it was serialized
yeah.
in first. And I'm just like spinning, in a circle trying to keep my bearings straight. So it's entertaining at the very least in that
No,
respect.
absolutely. I think it's really. it's a really brilliant setup because it makes it so accessible. And at least for me, somebody who has not read The Dark Tower, I am not always a huge fantasy person.
Mhm.
Sometimes I struggle with fantasy. So that was always my reasoning of like not having started it sooner. And I was talking to somebody else who has, and they were like, okay, you're gonna have to get through the gunslinger. Like knowing you, you're gonna have to get through the gunslinger. I don't think that you're gonna really care for it, but then drawing of three is gonna like really be for you, and then that'll seal the deal, and then you'll be set for the rest. And so I'm like, okay, got it. But so even though I haven't read it, to hear that that was your
Yeah.
experience, it's very funny. But to have it to where it's literally Nat who literally can rattle off a
Yeah.
king fact. Like I talked to that man about the stand, and I was like, it's not that they're both incredibly Neil and Nat are
Hmm.
both incredibly nice. So it's never that you're afraid that they're gonna make fun of you or something for whatever that you say, but you know that they're so knowledgeable on it.
Yeah.
You're like, well, I kind of thought this, but.
Oh, yeah,
They're
totally.
so gracious about, because I've talked to both of them about some King stuff and they're both very, very gracious. And so I love that y'all are doing it. I think it's great. I think it's going to pull a lot of readers in for The Dark Tower. I love
Yeah.
the setup of it. I think it's super smart.
Yeah, I mean, and it was funny because I was at StokerCon and Neil was going on and on about King, and he asked me a question about it, and I was like, "Hey, guy, uh, I got to tell you something, man. I've only read on writing," and he's like, "What?" And then it was like a little while later, he was like, "I got this idea. How about we use your idiocy to our advantage?" You know, he didn't put it that way. He didn't put it. That's my hyperbole, but
Yeah.
and I was like, "That's a great idea." Like, I love the idea of being the know nothing in the room that's like experiencing it. You're, holding my eyeballs open and I'm seeing it for the first time. So it's been
Yeah.
so much fun. Like, I'm
Good.
so excited. I'm so glad he asked me to do it. It's just a ton of fun.
I love that so much. That's so awesome. Oh
Yeah.
man. Well, Chris, this has been an absolute delight. Like I said, I've been kind of dying to talk to you for like a year, and now it's kind of come to be where I had the ability to do so. So I'm super glad that we were able to do this.
I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. When I saw your DM asking about this, I was like, this is awesome because I watch all your stuff on Instagram. I watch your reels. So I'm a
Yeah.
consumer of your content.
Well, I appreciate you watching along. We're just figuring out as we go,
Yeah.
because social media is just a mess right now. But that's a whole
Yeah.
other thing. But no, this has been just like an absolute delight. Thank you so much for making the time to chat with
Oh,
me. I can't recommend your books and like if Death on the Sway Back, I'm not even sure if it's available still. If that's available, people need to pick that up. And then of course, Redemption of Morgan Bright, people need to pick that up. And just staying tuned for whatever else comes next. People
yeah.
need to be paying attention.
Thank you so much for doing this after you had Mardi Gras celebrations. You're still awake, you're still upright. So it means a lot. I really do appreciate it. I am so lucky to be able to talk to people like you. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris, so much.
Bet.
I cannot thank Chris enough for his time, his kindness, his generosity, and also just his knowledge. I mean, as you've heard, he's just like a wealth of knowledge about editing and writing and being creatively resilient. That's like one of the best parts of this conversation, I think, is having that conversation of what it means to be quote unquote tough creatively, what it means to not get discouraged, what it means to keep persevering even whenever things don't necessarily feel like they're at their best. If there's any testament to that, it's probably this podcast. But at any rate, just all of the thanks to Chris. He's a lovely, lovely guest, and I hope to talk to him again soon. Um, yeah, so, again, if you stuck this far, this is our first official outro. To kind of give you a little bit of a heads up of what we have coming up next on the podcast, I am trying to stay on a little bit more of a stricter schedule and get you guys episodes weekly. Of course, there's going to be times whenever life gets in the way, and that's just not going to be feasible. And my plan for that is to actually release my backlog episodes that are available on YouTube onto my podcasting platform now. And so that way, those conversations will be available in their entirety with everything else all in one place eventually. So be on the lookout for those. But I do have a lot of exciting guests that I am talking to, and in the next few weeks, I plan on releasing quite a few interviews. I will go ahead and spoil next week's guest. It's going to be Liz Karen, Rachel Harrison, and William Sterling, and we are talking about punk and horror and about the Punk Goes Horror anthology that's coming out from Press. Ugh, I can't even say that. On March 11th. It is a dream of a conversation. I absolutely adore talking to them, and I would talk to them every week about whatever's going on in their lives. But in specific, we do talk about punk music, horror, their stories, and what you can look forward to in that Punk Goes Horror anthology. So if that's something that you're looking forward to, make sure that you stay tuned next week for that episode. So I guess without further ado, this is where I say goodbye. Thank you all so, so much for listening. It has been an absolute treat, getting able to develop this and grow with this. Even if it hasn't been quite as cohesive as I was hoping for, it's still been an absolute delight, and I cannot thank all of you who listen and who reshare and just do everything to get this in other people's ears. So thank you all, and until next time, I'll see y'all.